I hope you find today's event really interesting and informative. The theme of the day is tackling domestic abuse, the experiences in Northern Ireland and lessons from the pandemic. The last couple of years have been challenging for all of us who work in this field. We know that when the government restrictions and the COVID restrictions came into place, there was an increase in cases of domestic abuse. And many of us, particularly those working on the front line, were dealing with those cases. We have an absolutely fantastic lineup of speakers with you today, people who have both frontline and strategic experience of dealing with the issue of domestic abuse. We have the Chief Executive of Belfast and Lisburn's Women's Aid, Kelly Andrews, and Kelly's going to provide an overview of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland and the impact of the pandemic. Our next speaker is Detective Superintendent Lindsay Fisher from the PSNI. We then have Probation's Assistant Director Liz Arthur, who's going to explain how probation has responded to some of the domestic abuse reforms. Our next speaker is again from Probation Assistant Director Jill Grant, who's going to talk about some of the programme delivery aspects of probation practice. And then finally, we will have the Domestic Homicide Review Chair Anne Marks, who's going to reflect on the first 18 months since the introduction of domestic homicide reviews. So we have full lineup of speakers, a really packed agenda. I hope you all enjoy today. Please, as we go along, if you want to put questions into the chat function, myself and the team will monitor them. If you want to put up your hand, once the speakers finish and ask a question, that's fine too, but just be mindful at the end, there is an opportunity as well for question and answers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kelly Andrews.
Hello and welcome everyone to this afternoon's session, and thank you to Probation Board for inviting me along to speak to you today. Hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint. Great, that's always good. Quite a big topic to really discuss, an overview of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland and the impact of the pandemic, because I don't think we fully know the impact of the pandemic, but I can certainly give an overview of our experience within Women's Aid. So just a very brief outline of what I will be discussing today. Domestic abuse in Northern Ireland, Women's Aid, a regional picture of services, impact of the pandemic, responding to the pandemic, multi-agency collaboration, which was extremely important, and new legislative protections, which we very much welcome, and violence against women and girls. Domestic abuse in Northern Ireland, now some of you will be well aware of these figures, and I'm sure Lindsay will expand on them further, but from the PSNI statistics, from the period the 1st of January to the 31st of December 2021, there was 28,829 domestic abuse crimes recorded in Northern Ireland, the highest number recorded for a 12-month period since records began. So massive numbers coming through there that the police are dealing with. The police recorded 32,219 domestic abuse incidents. That's an average of 88 incidents per day. And then from the 1st of February to the 31st of January 2022, there were 7 women murdered in Northern Ireland. But if you look at it from March 2020 to today, it was actually 13 women were murdered, the last one being Alison Nelson. So, you know, we do have a problem with femicide in Northern Ireland. So Women's Aid in Northern Ireland is the lead voluntary organisation addressing domestic abuse and providing services to women and children. It's made up of 8 local groups across Northern Ireland. Sorry, did my share come off there?
It did, Kelly.
Apologies. Don't know what happened there. It's made up of 8 local groups in Northern Ireland, and we come together to form the federation. There we go. That's my slide there. And the purpose is to address challenges and attitudes and structural and systems which perpetuate domestic abuse in Northern Ireland. We provide emergency temporary refuge accommodation funded by the Supporting People programme as part of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, have a floating support service within the community, and are also funded by, well, Belfast Lisburn Women's Aid. We're funded by Belfast Trust and South Eastern Trust to work with children and young people who experience domestic abuse. No surprise, Women's Aid has a very strong feminist ethos, strong ethos of women, working with women by women. Sorry, I really don't know what's happening here. It just seems to be.
A glitch in the technology. Are you back up again?
Yeah, I'm back up. I'm just having to go back into it all the time. I don't know why it's doing that. Well, I can find my slide. Where are we? So some of the regional, the amount of women that we supported when housed in refuge during 2020 to 21, so covering really the first and sort of going into second lockdown period, was 530 women and 319 children in Northern Ireland. That's quite a lot when you think of the population of Northern Ireland. And in the community, it was 6,005 women and 6,450 children in the community again. That's a large number of women that are being supported. There's around 200 staff across Women's Aid in Northern Ireland that are providing services, both refuge accommodation and in the community. There was 293 women who were pregnant that received support. We know that a lot of domestic abuse starts in pregnancy, particularly when women are feeling vulnerable. And we also had 10 babies born in refuge. And just for a local level for Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid, there was 266 women and 163 children in our emergency refuge temporary accommodation. And we supported 814 women and just over 1,000 children in the community. And our trafficking project supported 66 women and 27 children during that period. At the moment, that project has massively increased, and there's like 130 women in that project at the moment. So the impact of the pandemic, I think we can all agree that COVID-19 pandemic presented us all with unprecedented challenges. Women's Aid were very quick off the mark, I believe. Before the first lockdown was announced in Northern Ireland, Women's Aid came together, all the local groups with the Federation, and a letter was drafted that went to the Permanent Secretary of Department of Communities, Justice and Health, outlining what Women's Aid felt was going to be the concern that we had going forward if services were more or less closed and locked down, and how that would impact on victims of domestic abuse and women and children who use our services. We were very keen that we would be open and maintain services as much as possible while still trying to protect our staff and our service users. So I think it was really quick to get off the mark there, and it was really, really needed. We knew that just the government message, you know, stay home, stay safe, that wasn't going to work for women that were in abusive relationships, and the possibility of abuse increasing and the fear of that. And then there was also massive concern about a reduction to access to services. A lot of statutory services were moving to home working. Our community support team were moving to home working. And, you know, when we look back during that period, we hadn't even got the IT to support that. So it was a massive change that happened very, very quickly. We were very fortunate that we were able to get funding from Comic Relief, that we were able to invest in our IT infrastructure and our telephones to ensure that we were accessible and to allow staff to work from home and then to have that blended approach. But it's very important to know, I think, and recognise that all our refuge staff were still coming into work during the first lockdown, second lockdown and third lockdown. And really our community support team, it was only really the first lockdown that they worked from home, and from then they were continuing with some face-to-face and then, you know, utilising video call technology. And I've just mentioned there again, tragically, we had 13 women murdered in Northern Ireland. So responding to the pandemic, really important to get the message out there. During March 2020 and April 2020, our referrals dropped. And that was quite alarming, considering that we knew the police were receiving more calls and the helpline was receiving more calls. So like we were going, where are these women going? So we knew we had to get the message out there that we were still open. I think that was really, really important. So, you know, contacted a few of our local radio stations, and they were kind enough to get the message out, which was really, really helpful. And then with some funding that we got from Belfast City Council and the Housing Executive, we started a very much a bottom-up campaign, a poster campaign. So this is around the time of June 2020. So we heard coming out of France that that they had this program of pharmacies, and it wasn't operational in Northern Ireland or the UK at that time. So we contacted the Pharmaceutical Society in Northern Ireland and got the names and addresses from all the pharmacies in our area and posted them out a poster. That poster there, which is shown, which we were able to display in the pharmacies, and then we were actually able to share that with our sister women's aid groups, and then they were able to, you know, adopt it for their area and share it. And it was in supermarkets, Tesco's, Asda, Sainsbury's. We contacted Henderson's Group, who own a lot of Spar stores. They wanted a poster for all their stores across Northern Ireland. And when people were queuing up, you will recall having the queue going into the supermarket, the posters were there. And I think that was really important to get the message out. One of the things that we did notice as well is that we had an increase in email communication coming in. So in a direct response to that, we set up a web chat service, and that was set up in 5 weeks with no additional funding. We had some goodwill where it was embedded basically in our website for free. And we had Scottish Women's Aid who kindly shared with their policies and procedures and manuals, which we were able to adopt for Northern Ireland. We were able to train staff of Belfast Lisburn Women's Aid, and Foyle Women's Aid also are a partner on that, and deliver that service. And that was really good, because when we were able to access online communication, maybe in a different, you know, it was safer than perhaps making a phone call, and able to access services through that way. So that we're still delivering that service at the moment, and that has been successful. I mentioned a little bit about the poster campaign, which you know, was very successful as well. And then the following year in 2021, some of you may recall that we had a regional Unlock Your Lockdown campaign, which really got the message out there, and there was billboards around Belfast and Derry and other parts of the province, and that was very successful to get the message out there. And I think we really utilised social media and had information on safety planning, little quizzes, you know, if you think you're experiencing domestic abuse, and we tailored them, so like for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and trying to get the message out there. And of course it's free using social media. Majority of the time it's free. You can of course pay to boost ads, which we did do as well, but in comparison to like paying for an ad in a newspaper, it's a fraction of the cost. So that was very important way and method to get the message out that we were still open and here to support women. So multi-agency collaboration, I mean, I think the pandemic showed that when the pressure was on, agencies can come together. Women's Aid worked so well with the PSNI during this period, and I would say the Housing Executive also. There was a period, it was Christmas, I think, 2020, where we had a COVID-19 outbreak among the staff in one of our refuges, and we had to restrict access to that refuge because we just had no staff basically for 2-week periods. And the housing executive, housing solutions team really stepped up and worked with us and worked with the PSNI on getting emergency temporary accommodation single lets for women that needed it while our refuge provision was restricted for those 2 weeks. Thankfully, we didn't have any outbreaks among the women residents within the refuge, which was really, really, you know, recognising that the PPE was really working and all that. It was among the staff team. So we were facing many challenges, the same as many other services. We were lucky enough that the trust provided us with PPE, which was very much welcomed, and we were able to get vaccination rollout quite early on. Once all the trust staff had received it, we were pretty much on the list, and that was very, very much welcomed because it enabled us to stay open and accessible and to continue providing services in a safe way. We were very lucky as well that Belfast City Council were able to provide us with hardship money that we were able to distribute to women and children across Belfast who were experiencing domestic abuse. So that was vouchers for food, help with gas, online broadband. So that was really, really useful. And we distributed that on I think we had 3 separate tranches of that, which we were able to, at one point I thought our training room was nearly turning into a distribution centre. There was bags of groceries going out and the staff were really stepping up to help deliver that food at that time, because you will remember the big queues, particularly in the first lockdown. And I'd just really like to thank those agencies there on how well, you know, we all work together. And I think it's important as well to note the Probation Board in Northern Ireland, the Promoting Positive Relationship Programme continued as well during that period as well, and Women's Aid are a partner helping to support female victims of perpetrators that are involved in that programme. So that's very successful also. During this period as well, the Department of Justice and the Police Service for Northern Ireland commissioned a new advocacy service in January 2021, and in the April, the contract was awarded as a part of a collaboration bid to Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid, Men's Advisory Project and Foyle Family Justice Centre, and we formed a consortium, Assist NI, and some of you may have heard from Michelle Martin, who was the project manager there. I know she's been around a number of agencies promoting the service and sharing information about the service. That's a new domestic and sexual abuse advocacy service, and it's been operational for 6 months. So still a very young service, but really making an impact already. And I've no doubt that that will continue to grow. Assist received 8,731 adult referrals and 752 children referrals. That's for a 6-month period. And I've no doubt that that will only grow as the service continues to develop and grow. So during the last while as well, we also saw some new legislative protections, which was very much welcome after having no assembly for 3 years, although we still have no government at the moment, but hopefully that won't last too long and certainly won't go on 3 years. We have the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, which is, you know, makes coercive control an offence and has a child aggravator. Very much welcome that, and that is now becoming operational. We also have the Protections from Stalking Bill, which has received royal assent, and again, very much welcome. And then the Justice Bill, which was an enormous bill as well, which had non-fatal strangulation, removes the rough sex defence. It also had upskirting and downblousing and online communication grooming of a child. So that was a pretty substantive bill. So the Justice Department have been very busy getting that legislation now, and I know the Justice Committee and Women's Aid were called as expert witness. Sonia McMullen gave evidence there on behalf of Women's Aid regionally and helped shape those pieces of legislation there. So very much welcome. Looking forward to seeing them rolled out and hopefully seeing more victims protected. We're going to hear a lot more detail on domestic homicide reviews later on. just that they've been introduced in Northern Ireland, very much welcome it. And there's currently 5 DHRs live, as far as I know, although I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that later on. I'm currently a panel member on one, so looking forward to seeing the learning coming from there. And there is some measures already taking place. We have training that's going out across the PSNI. We also have the Department of Health working with GPs to train them up as well, so that they're more aware, and Women's Aid are involved in that as well. And that's learning certainly from England, and I'm sure it'll come out with the Domestic Homicide Reviews here in Northern Ireland, the IRIS project. I would like to see that rolled out across Northern Ireland. A violence against women and girls strategy. So currently we're the only part of the UK that doesn't have the strategy. During lockdown, we launched a petition calling for a violence against women and girls strategy. We were very lucky that we had a lot of support from local MLAs and MPs, and from MPs in Westminster, and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister announced their commitment to the strategy. And we have seen progress on this in that the officials have been appointed within the Executive Office and have been tasked with bringing this forward. And we had the recent consultation, the Equally Safe strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. However, the proof will be in the pudding. You know, we want to see what funding is going to be allocated to that strategy. Police need funding, probation need funding, Department of Education and Department of Health and Domestic Abuse Support Services will need funding. So we'll see how serious our politicians are about making that actually happen. But I'm hopeful that we will get some funding to make a difference. I mean, we can see the learning from England and Scotland and Wales, so hopefully we can replicate some of that within Northern Ireland. We still have some legislative gaps. If you look at the domestic abuse bill that went through England and Wales, it's far more comprehensive than the legislation that we have here. So we still look on across the border with envy at the protections that they have over there, but I've no doubt we will get there eventually. We have a new political mandate coming up and plenty of politicians that we can lobby. So we will continue to do that. We would love to see a domestic abuse commissioner for Northern Ireland. I recently was speaking to Nicola Jacobs, the domestic abuse commissioner in England and Wales, she on Tuesday there, and it was very interesting hearing about her work. We would like to see a serial perpetrator register for domestic abuse and stalking. We would very much welcome a full review of the family courts and review of the child contact system. We are hearing from women how the trauma of going through the family courts and how that is used by perpetrators to further abuse them, and it really needs looked at. A review of tendering and procurement for specialist services such as domestic and sexual violence services, changes to housing and homelessness legislation for those who are escaping domestic violence and abuse, secure tenancies, ensure that welfare policies to protect women and their children, reforms to ensure that migrant survivors have equal access to protection and support. Women that have no recourse to public funds need support as well, and it's important that that's recognised by government. New legislation coming in, it needs adequate funding as well. So the new Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act needs funding to really make it effective. We would welcome a review of the MARC process, domestic abuse specialist courts, training for all judges, and ratification of the Istanbul Convention. That was just a very whistle-stop tour of some of the challenges that we faced across Northern Ireland and Women's Aid, and I'm happy to take some questions later on or now. Or
Kelly, thank you for that. That was really, really interesting, and some really, I suppose, stark facts coming out there. The number of women in Northern Ireland for such a small population who have sadly been murdered over the period of the pandemic. Some of the challenges that you faced in terms of getting the message out, particularly in the early days of COVID, with that small number of referrals and the very quick action to rectify that in terms of the publicity. And I suppose most tellingly, maybe when the pressure was on, the value of partnership working, which again was key, and that's why we've brought everybody together in the spirit of partnership today. If there is any pressing questions for Kelly now, we can take 1 or 2 questions, or if you want to hold them until the panel, that's grand. I'm not seeing anything in the chat function, so I think we will move on. And just as we talked about partners, and one of the key partners for Women's Aid is the police service. We're going to hear today from Detective Superintendent Lindsay Fisher, who works really closely with probation and the other justice organisation as well as Women's Aid. And Lindsay's going to talk about the police's role in protecting the public and how the police service has responded to both the domestic abuse reforms, which Kelly mentioned in her presentation, and indeed to the pandemic over the last 18 months. So Lindsay, I'm handing over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Just wonder if you can pop my presentation up, because I had some challenges in doing that. Perfect, thank you. If we just move into the first slide. Oh, there we go. I suppose really I just wanted to start and take a moment to think about each and every victim who is suffering domestic abuse, because as Kelly referenced, and I'll talk a little bit more about stats in a second, the numbers of people that are experiencing domestic abuse now during the pandemic and even pre-pandemic are startling, and we know that that is simply the tip of the iceberg. We know that on average, people will experience up to 35 incidents of domestic abuse before they're picking up the phone to police. So I think if we all keep that at the back of our minds whenever we are looking at the statistics, and think not only about those who have been able to pick up that phone, but also those who are still really suffering in silence. And my first slide is really just to focus attention around what police are doing and the importance that we put on domestic abuse. Domestic abuse as a crime type within PSNI is a strategic priority, and really that highlights not only the importance and the focus, but the governance and accountability around investigations, investigative standards, practices and protocols. And our strategic priority the pyramid here is really to focus on what we do. So our vision is obviously very much linked with the policing board objectives, that we are having a community that is safe from domestic abuse, that we have a community that has confidence in policing and confidence to report domestic abuse, and that we support victims that need individual support, whether it's through criminal justice or presenting pathways for their support. Our indicators there are again looking at reducing the repeat number of victims. We see on average between 24 and 26% of our overall demand in terms of calls for service and crime types being those that are experiencing repeated domestic abuse, those that are reporting repeatedly, and therefore the repeat perpetrators that go alongside that. As I mentioned, we have significant governance and accountability measures, and that's really to focus our attention, recognising that victim attrition in the area of domestic and sexual crime is huge. So many victims don't feel able and strong enough to engage in what is a really challenging process. If we think about the end-to-end, from picking up that phone to police to actually seeing a criminal justice outcome in court. I'll talk a little bit more about domestic abuse courts in a moment. So we will focus on trying to be evidence-led and trying to make sure that we are providing the best quality service to victims from the second that they pick up that phone. And that is about making sure that our call handlers, so those people that victims are reporting to, first and foremost, they've had our training package on domestic abuse, that they're making sure that they're getting resources to attend in a timely manner, that they are using 999 responses, that blue lights, to make sure that they are able to get there. And we're always looking at different ways of supporting technology around that as well, and making sure that we try our best to keep victims engaged whilst we're trying to attend, especially if there's something ongoing. Our use of body-worn video really has been a key focus over the last number of years because it provides a really unique opportunity to have eyes and ears for whenever police arrive, because we recognise that in the mouth of trauma, people may say something that is really vital and valid to our early stages of our investigation. So I'm really pleased to highlight that our use of body-worn video, which is something actually that up until about 2 years ago, we weren't accurately able to record and reflect, but we're now seeing over 90% compliance in emergency domestic abuse calls. And just at the bottom then of our triangle, you will see our cornerstones. And really that's what drives everything above that. Legislation and guidance, our investigative standards, training and awareness, and victim and offender focus. And you'll see that throughout everything that we're trying to do, whether that's working with our statutory organisations and criminal justice partners, or whether that's working with our voluntary and support services to make sure that we remain victim and trauma informed in all of our practices. Move on to the next slide. The stats that are highlighted here are actually hot off the press. We saw a new NISRA publication just this morning. So tragically, we have seen 33,000 domestic abuse incidents, so 33,000 domestic abuse calls for service, which is an increase in almost 2,000 in the previous 12 months. And again, our domestic abuse crimes at almost 22,000. And again, such a significant increase of over 2,500, almost 3,000 crimes on the previous 12 months. And again, as we're seeing year in, year out, that this is recorded as the highest number of stats since we started recording data in this way in 2004, 2005, which is startling because, and I don't think we can ever lose focus on behind each and every one of those numbers, there is a victim and their story and their experiences, and not just their own, but their families, their close friends. The impact, the ripple effect is huge. And there's and really across all of our 11 police districts, Northern Ireland serve 11 police districts, and each and every one of them have actually experienced a higher level of domestic abuse crime over the last 12 months. We just move on. So really just to highlight the definition that we look to for domestic abuse, and this is relevant because as Kelly referenced, we have seen new introduction of legislation which really focuses around coercive controlling behaviour. So threatening, controlling, coercive violence or abuse, looking at psychological, virtual, physical, verbal, sexual, financial or emotional, inflicted on anyone irrespective of age, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation or any other disability. I think that's really important, and the two that I would like to focus on just for a moment is virtual and coercive controlling behaviour. As again Kelly referenced, the impact and how we moved onto an online platform. That was every single individual, organisation, family member, that was how they communicated. So if you have somebody controlling your verbal, your virtual, your emotional space, you can imagine how you're feeling whenever you hear the government messaging about stay at home, stay safe. It's every single aspect of a person's life taking control and really each and every day debilitating that person even further. And so we just move on. So as you'll have seen there from the stats, there's a continuing debate in respect of crime versus incident. What does that mean? Why do we record both? I think it's really important to know, firstly, from a senior police officer, it's important for me to know how many times we're called out to a domestic abuse incident. It's important to know for voluntary services how many times, because whilst they may not reach the criminal threshold, it's important for the voluntaries to know that there is still something so significant that they picked up the phone to police, or that a neighbour picked up the phone to police on their behalf, or a family member or a child. So I think it's really important that we do record in that way. And it's also important to reflect that as we move forward with additional legislative provisions, some of those non-crime or incidents may actually be now seen as a pattern of coercive controlling behaviour and may then become a crime type. So it's just to highlight what that might look like. So it may be that it's to prevent a breach of the peace, to prevent a partner coming in to retrieve property or a family member. Or it could be that child contact has gone wrong, the child hasn't been returned, or that there's been a return and there's been some kind of incident at the door. Again, it's really important that we are there to protect that victim, but it's also important that we identify where criminal threshold is crossed. And as I said, the landscape has changed now quite significantly with the new domestic abuse offence, and we are seeing that coercive controlling behaviour, that emotional abuse, that debilitating, demeaning behaviour will make up part of a coercive controlling behaviour and a coercive conduct. Next slide, please. So what did we do during the pandemic to support victims of domestic abuse? And again, like Kelly, as a frontline service, police were still in work, responding to calls, whether they were in a medical emergency, whether we were going into situations where people had COVID. Each and every call for service had to be risk assessed and attended, particularly those where there were crimes in action or where there was a vulnerable person needing our support. So there were a number of schemes really that we introduced alongside our normal governance and accountability around domestic abuse. And the two schemes at the top really were repeat callback schemes, where we recognise that a call for service isn't the end of what is going on in the home, that a person may have the partner back, a family member back into the home. So our callback scheme was really an opportunity to reach out post crisis, post trauma of the initial report, and find out, one, if there were any other offences that hadn't been reported at the time, to try and seek a criminal justice outcome, to remove the perpetrator, to seek that support and criminal justice outcome for a victim, but also to make sure that in that moment they really understood what support services were available and see whether or not there was any other additional referrals that were required. And during that time, we reached out to thousands of victims. We identified over 70 new offences during that time from those victims and made a significant number of referrals. Recognising that our partners were experiencing, in that first lockdown, they were experiencing different trends than ourselves. As Kelly has said, referrals were going down, but quite clearly calls for service within policing were going up. So we very quickly introduced a COVID partners meeting, and really this was, as it says, it was really about getting our key partners around the phone, as it was at that stage, to see what's going on, what are you doing, what can we do to help, what else can we do, where are the struggles. And really that had really good attendance, and we kept that in place really throughout all of the lockdowns. And as I say, we were placing an increased overall demand. Other crime types might have been down, but domestic abuse was still very much front and centre in terms of our call for service. And I'm also really pleased to say that even though there was an increased call for service and increased demand, we still kept our criminal justice outcome rates really high for victims of domestic abuse. We also prepared for a number of future projects. You can imagine that trying as a large organisation to police and train for new legislation, but we managed to introduce new domestic abuse offence with training that went out to over 6,000 individual officers and staff members during a pandemic. We also were able to support that training through WebEx sessions, FAQs, using online forums, really to make sure that officers and staff members were ready for the introduction of new legislation. We continue to maintain governance and accountability structures for domestic abuse domestic abuse investigations. And that's not just through PPS, but also our reporting to the Policing Board, reporting to the Department of Justice, reporting to various ministers, the Chief Constable, to make sure that we were doing everything that we could, that we were aware of escalating behaviours, and that we were making sure that we could manage and police not just the investigations, but also the referral processes, for example, MARAC. So, and I know that Anne will obviously touch on this much more towards the end, but we also had our joint working with our statutory partners to introduce Domestic Homicide Review process for Northern Ireland, which whenever we see the high numbers of domestic homicide, we can only think that this is a very welcome addition to our toolkit, because we can never lose sight of the fact that there is a risk of fatal domestic abuse. And it's really important that we try and, as organisations, statutory, voluntary, and members of the public, that we learn from that, we look and we strive to do better and do more. And as Kelly mentioned, we had key partners involved in the advocacy service for victims of domestic and sexual abuse, which is really key to making sure that we are supporting victims through the criminal justice process, through MARAC and through the Rowan process, recognising that this is significantly traumatic experience. To pick up the phone in the first place, to phone police and tell a police officer or staff member the very intimate parts of their relationship, the abuse that has been going on for weeks, months, decades, to then see that through the doors of a criminal justice outcome is really, really important. We move on to the next slide. And so what trends really did we see? As we've talked quite a lot already this morning, the overall crime increased, but also we were seeing that the severity in crimes was also increasing, particularly during that first lockdown. So we were seeing more, and whenever I reference serious, obviously all domestic abuse is serious, but whenever we think about those crimes that attract more significant sentences, for example, we were seeing more high harm physical assaults. We were seeing that those behaviours at that high injury threshold. And we were also seeing, as we said, various sexual domestic abuse offences as well. So whilst we obviously during periods of lockdown were seeing a reduction in overall sexual crime because the nighttime economy was significantly reduced, we were seeing historical and non-recent domestic sexual abuse reported, and we have done a number of pieces of work to try and identify why that might have been, and we're currently working on a piece of research to see, would we have known about the sexual crime if there hadn't been a new incident reported during the pandemic. And up until the pandemic years, Christmas sadly was always, since we started looking at our stats in 2004, 2005, was always reported as the highest reporting period. However, during those lockdown years, we saw July 2020 and July 2021 as actually our highest period. And for some reason, February remains consistently the period where the lowest reporting was experienced. Just to note, in respect of reported calls for service during the Christmas period in 2021, we actually was just focusing on those key days, the public holiday days, and those that come between Christmas and the New Year. We actually saw an increase of 12% in terms of calls for service, which is hugely significant whenever we already see that there are really high numbers in terms of our calls for service. If you just go to the next slide, please. So we've focused quite a lot around the new Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, and I'm just going to do a very quick whistle-stop tour around this. We are really welcome to see that we have a new domestic abuse offence. This looks at that coercive controlling behaviour, those behaviours that previously wouldn't have amounted to a criminal offence. And throughout the introduction and preparation for that, I spoke to a number of officers who, whenever they read the legislation, did the training, they said, it's that moment where you walk into a house, the hairs in the back of your neck stand on end, and you can see the toxicity. But up until that point, we weren't able to do anything with that. There was no crimes. We could obviously reach out to our support services and make sure that there was, you know, appropriate support and guidance there. But from a criminal justice, from a policing perspective, there was really very little that we could do. This criminalises the abusive behaviour, and it also creates aggravators that can be attached to not only the domestic abuse offence, recognising that domestic abuse is a challenge and is happening in relationships where there are under 18s. We do see intimate partner domestic abuse, domestic sexual abuse within our under 18s. We also see sibling and parent on child, child on parent domestic abuse. So it's really important that we are able now to focus on the aggravators, but also that we have an aggravator that we are able to identify and recognise children that have seen, heard, been used, felt the impact of that domestic abuse coming into a home day and daily where they see and feel that toxicity. But also that we're actually able to highlight and strengthen our criminal justice outcomes around other offences. So where we see a domestic abuse motivation, we're now able to add a domestic abuse aggravator that highlights to the courts, highlights to the perpetrator that we recognise the severity around this, and this can be reflected in terms of sentencing opportunities. I think it's really important to highlight that at the moment, whilst operational figures only, and we have only had the legislation in since the end of February, we're seeing that domestic abuse aggravator in almost 80% of our statutory, our other statutory offences. So if we see not a pattern of behaviour, but an isolated incident of common assault, that we're adding that aggravator, and that's happening in 80%, up to 80% of our cases. And again, always focusing around the support. This provides additional support by ensuring that victims are considered for special measures. Just moving to the next slide. Again, this really is just to focus around what the course of conduct or course of behaviour might be. So it's abuse of another person where there's a personal connection, and that is about family members, intimate partners, ex-intimate partners, where there's a reasonable person. So not a criminal justice practitioner, not an expert, but Joe Public. Joe Public thinks that a reasonable person thinks this is wrong. This is likely to cause the victim physical or psychological harm. And I always put that, and many people have probably heard me saying it, that we think about our parents, we think about what they would think, you know, because legislation is complicated, even for practitioners. So if Joe Public or your mum and dad can see this is wrong, that's the sort of focus around reasonable person test. And that they intend, so it's the intention that that person is intending to cause the victim to suffer physical or psychological harm, or is reckless. So they don't care. They don't care whether the impact will see significant physical or psychological harm. It doesn't have to actually suffer significant harm, but it's the impact, it's the intention, it's the person that has perpetrated that behaviour. If we just move on. And again, I've highlighted most of that already through discussions. If we just move on to the next slide. Sorry, if we just move on. Yeah, perfect. So giving confidence to victims, what are policing doing in this area? So there's continued work with our voluntary and statutory partners to ensure that training and awareness is trauma informed and victim focused, and that the new training, as I said, has been rolled out to almost 6,000 officers and staff members. We're also looking at training packages to be provided for upcoming legislative changes in terms of stalking, non-fatal strangulation, upskirting, down-blousing, and we're continuing to think evidence-led. Use of body-worn video to seek to secure criminal justice outcomes. As I mentioned already, we're seeing 90% compliance around that. We'll continue to see dip sample of quality risk assessments and referrals, and an investigative standards with PPS. We're hoping to launch our new service level agreement with PPS in coming weeks and months, which really highlight what's expected of both agencies in terms of criminal justice outcomes. We also, as I said, the accountability and focus around domestic abuse is key. So we have monthly meetings, really, which reflect end-to-end service for victims of domestic abuse. So from that first call taker, we are assessing their response. We're making sure that they receive that quality service, right through to looking at evidential difficulties that we might experience. And we will continue to provide our full support to the Domestic Homicide Review process to identify learning through tragic failed domestic abuse. And we will continue to look at the training and learning that is required to do that. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me.
Lindsay,
Sorry,
thank you
very much. A whistle stop tour, and happy to answer questions either now or at the end.
Lindsay, thank you very much for that. There was just a comment just about Kelly previously. I just don't want to lose that in the chat function from James Bingham, just saying he's a member of Lisburn and Castlereagh PCSP, which financially supported the support worker for Women's Aid in Lisburn PSNI station for a number of years, and welcomed the professional work that was carried out. And he wanted to thank Women's Aid for the restructuring that resulted in this post being funded from within their own resources, and if he can be of any further assistance to please get in touch. So good partnership work in there in action. So thank you so much, Lindsay, for that. That was a really, really useful overview. And again, some of those stats were just staggering. 33,000 domestic abuse incidents, which is a really, really, as you said, really significant increase. And sadly, the idea that people suffer more than 35 incidents before they might make a report to police just shows how important the upstream work that many of the justice organisations are carrying out is, when you hear figures like that. And again, Lindsay, Lindsay is and her team are a really, really important partner of ours, and have been in that partnership work. If there's a theme through COVID, and I suppose if there was a silver lining of COVID, it was the absolute value of our partners and our partnership working, which has absolutely increased over the years. Lindsay, thank you for that. Just checking the chat to see if there's any questions. There's one in from Aileen McLaughlin. Has there been a corresponding increase in the number of male victims of domestic abuse during the pandemic? And there's another in from Ailish Teague, just asking what constitutes a course of behaviour for the new domestic abuse legislation. Lindsay, are you able to answer those?
Once I get myself off mute, I was able to, yes. I think in terms of the breakdown of domestic abuse, and we have still got reporting challenges around those that identify as trans, or those that don't report their gender identity. So we do report, our focus is around male and female. So I do answer that in this context, that we still are seeing about 69% would be identifying as female victims of domestic abuse, and 31% would identify as male victims of domestic abuse. So we are reflectively seeing an increase with both, if that makes sense, because we're still seeing a fairly consistent breakdown between 66 and 69% female, and then the other side of that being male. So yes, there would have been an increase. It's very difficult to identify incidents and the gender identification, because you don't attach the relevant information in the same way to our systems. But in terms of crimes, yes, we are seeing a similar mirroring of female versus male. And in respect of course of conduct, without getting too technical around that, a course of conduct is 2 or more incidents where you see a pattern of behaviour developing. So that pattern of behaviour really, again, is about focusing on the intention of the person who is perpetrating that behaviour. So you could see behaviours like removing a mobile phone, removing money from an account or a purse or wallet, so that not because of the theft in itself, but because you know that if that person doesn't have phone or they don't have access to money, then they can't get to work, they can't go and see their family, they can't go and see their friends. So the intention behind the theft, the intention behind the lack of contact is to debilitate, to isolate, to demean. So that's an example of what course of conduct might look like, but equally it could also include other crime types, including malicious communications, physical assaults, sexually motivated assaults. So we look at all different crime types within that course of conduct.
Lindsay, you're not getting away easy here. There's a couple of others coming in. Janice Bunton has just asked, can you give any further breakdown for the figures of under 18 that you mentioned earlier?
In terms of our children as victims of domestic abuse or perpetrating?
Janice, do you want to give a shout out there, which you want?
As victims of domestic abuse.
Yeah, as victims of domestic abuse, we saw, I get the stats right now, we saw around 9% of an increase during the first lockdown, but that did level out during the others. Okay,
there are some other questions coming in here. It might be best just to take them now rather than later. If 31%, I'm not sure if you can answer this, Lindsay, and it might be one we come back to. Paul Witherston has asked about provision for men. If 31% of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland is against men, does provision for male victims reflect that statistic?
I suppose it's difficult for me to answer that, but I know that with our new advocacy service, that is very much a service that is available for all, in terms of gender, relationship breakdown, sexual offences, etc. So that service is open to male victims. There are also some local support networks, and then obviously MAP, who are a key partner in Assist. So we always have one eye to supporting male victims of domestic abuse, and I think it's really important to highlight that actually whenever we rolled out our training and awareness package internally, we worked not only with Women's Aid, we worked with Men's Advisory Project and also the Rainbow Project to make sure that we were trying to reach a cross section of victims, recognising that everybody's challenge is different. So we wanted to make sure that we were supporting all victims that come forward.
Lindsay, there's a question from Liverpool. They're just reflecting on the 13 to 18-year-old female domestic violence. Was it high before the pandemic, or have you seen an increase in 13 to 18-year-old female domestic violence victims? I assume that is. That he's just saying that works in North Liverpool, and they're seeing violence between male and females of that age group as normal.
Yeah, I think we see an increase at various junctures around children sort of in intimate partner relationships, but also whenever it is either child abuse or domestic abuse with an adult child and or a child on a parent as well. So there's lots of different breakdowns in terms of children experiencing domestic abuse as victim and perpetrators. But one of the things that we're actually currently looking at, because we're aware of gaps in provisions, gaps in identification of domestic abuse in young people, is that we're currently looking, following a case management review, at completing the DASH questions, even if it is on professional judgment, with young people, because currently that isn't a requirement. It is done occasionally, but it's not a requirement. And we're looking to work with our organisations to roll that out. So again, that will give us significantly better information around victims in that under 18 cohort and their experiences of domestic abuse.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. And we're just going to finish with one comment from Joanne McPadden, who said, just picking up on your point, in that context, I presume we should also acknowledge that perpetrators often report incidents or identify as victims, and that's not taken away from the high prevalence of men reporting, but mindful that domestic abuse and domestic abuse incidents are complex. Absolutely, Joanne. So I think we need to move on next to our Assistant Director, Liz Arthur. Liz is Head of Risk and is going to talk about how probation has responded to domestic abuse reforms in Northern Ireland and the impact of the pandemic. So Liz, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Gail, and hopefully everybody can see these slides. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Arthur, and as Gail says, I'm an Assistant Director with the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. I want to take some time this afternoon to talk about how PBNI works with perpetrators of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland, how we've responded to the domestic abuse reforms that have been outlined by Lindsay, and the lessons that we've learned from working through the pandemic. And in particular, I want to talk a bit about the role of the public protection arrangements for Northern Ireland in managing perpetrators of domestic abuse. I want to take some time to give you some background information about PBNI, but perhaps even before I do that, for the benefit of colleagues who are joining us from England and Wales, maybe just a bit of background information about Northern Ireland itself. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland is probably best known for what we refer to as the Troubles, and also our complex national identity, if I can put it like that, and that has been in evidence with the recent elections as well. But Northern Ireland is the smallest of the 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom in terms of both area and population. We have a population of about 1.9 million, 2 metropolitan areas within Northern Ireland, Belfast and Derry or Londonderry. But when you compare the size of the population in both Belfast and Derry to cities like Birmingham or London in England, it's fair to say that Northern Ireland is a fairly rural community. Worth noting that there are 5 cities in Northern Ireland: Belfast, Derry or Londonderry and Armagh. And since the Queen's Jubilee in 2002, there's 2 new cities, Newry and Lisburn. And for any of you who are fans of Pointless, you'll find that quite often Newry and Lisburn are pointless answers to any questions about capitals. There are many advantages to the size that Northern Ireland is and the fact that it is a fairly rural community. We only have 1 police service, 1 prison service, and indeed 1 probation service. And that undoubtedly assists with partnership working within Northern Ireland. I'm not sure if it's an advantage or a disadvantage, but the other thing you should know about Northern Ireland is that everybody knows everybody else. And if you don't know them personally, you'll know somebody who knows them. And this does, as I say, have advantages and disadvantages in this area of work. Some background information about PBNI. PBNI is a non-departmental public body of the Department of Justice. We were established in 1982, so this is our 40th anniversary. The fact that we are an arm's length organisation has enabled us to establish our own purpose and priorities and to devise a set of strategic aims and objectives, albeit these are aligned with the Minister of Justice's priorities. Within Northern Ireland, all probation officers are social work qualified and registered with the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. And probation's aim is to change lives for safer communities, and we do this by tackling the root causes of offending behaviour and rehabilitating individuals who have offended. The safeguarding of victims and protection of children remains a central focus of PBNI in all areas of our work. During the pandemic, given the increase in risks posed to victims as a result of periods of lockdown, PBNI has focused specifically on the area of domestic violence, and our recovery plan throughout the pandemic has prioritised work with the perpetrators of domestic abuse. PBNI is focused specifically on the area of domestic abuse, and there have been ongoing developments in regards to PBNI's assessments of risks, our interventions, and how we respond to domestic abusive behaviours. We remain committed to the training and development of our staff in this area of work, and I want to take just a few minutes to highlight recent training and developments in practice within PBNI. Mandatory training has taken place for all operational staff within PBNI to raise awareness of domestic abuse. Lindsay has outlined a number of the changes that the introduction of the Domestic Abuse Civil Proceedings Act has brought into play in Northern Ireland, and we have delivered mandatory training to all our operational staff in respect of this Act to enhance awareness of the Act, but also with a specific focus on coercive and controlling behaviour. We've also undertaken training on the completion of the brief spousal assault form for the evaluation of risk, known as Be Safer. As many of you know, Be Safer is a guide for the assessment and management of risk of intimate partner violence. And for all cases where there are convictions and/or concerns about domestic abuse, PBNI staff are required to complete this tool to assess the likelihood of future intimate partner violence and to prioritise cases and to identify the appropriate intervention to address and target domestic abusive behaviours. Perpetrators of domestic abuse who are assessed as low likelihood of committing further intimate partner violence are required to complete the PBNI Respectful Relationships programme. The primary goal of this programme is to promote healthy relationships and to reduce the risk of abuse against intimate partners and children. The programme is delivered as a one-to-one intervention. The accredited Building Better Relationships programme is the intervention delivered by PBNI for those individuals who are assessed as presenting a moderate or high likelihood of further intimate partner violence. As many of you know, this programme is delivered by trained and highly skilled programme facilitators, and it consists of 4 modules, each of which is comprised of 6 2.5-hour sessions. After each module, a practitioners' meeting is convened, attended by the supervising probation officer, the programme facilitator, and the partner support worker. Throughout the pandemic, BBR has been delivered online, and there are currently 5 BBR programmes being delivered, with another 3 scheduled to commence shortly. There are clearly many advantages from being able to deliver this programme online. One such advantage being that it can be delivered to a greater number of participants and over a greater geographical area. I think much credit needs to go to the programmes team within PBNI, that they have been able to adapt their service delivery model during the pandemic and have continued with this very important work with perpetrators of domestic abuse. We have also developed a programme known as Promoting Positive Relationships, and that's for individuals where there are concerns about intimate partner violence, but where those individuals have not been adjudicated. This programme is delivered by PBNI on behalf of the Health and Social Care Trusts, and it's illustrated just how important a joint approach between agencies is in targeting and addressing domestic abuse. I'm not going to say too much more about that because I know my colleague Jill is going to focus on the PPRP. PBNI has also developed the role of partner support worker. And the partner support worker offers support to victims, including the current and/or previous partners of those who are subject to probation supervision and who are undertaking respectful relationships intervention or participating in the Building Better Relationships programme. The partner support worker not only provides supports to the victims and signposts them to other services that are available, but they're also an important conduit between the victim and ensuring that the victim's voice is heard in the management and supervision of perpetrators of domestic abuse. PBNI has an information sharing agreement with the Police Service for Northern Ireland, and this allows information about police call-outs to be shared both at the pre-sentence stage and also whilst an individual is subject to supervision with PBNI. And this clearly enhances PBNI's ability to complete accurate assessments of domestic abusive behaviours and to identify appropriate interventions. PBNI continues to work collaboratively with its voluntary and statutory partners. These partnerships include the multi-agency risk assessment conferences. Within Northern Ireland, this forum was established in 2010, and it provides an effective multi-agency response to high-risk victims of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland. The aim of AMARC is to manage and reduce risk by sharing relevant information and providing actions to support victims. The policing and community safety partnerships are local bodies made up of councillors and representatives from statutory bodies. They focus on the policing and community issues that matter most in particular areas, and many PCSPs, as we've heard earlier, have funded initiatives to support victims of domestic abuse and also initiatives to address the concerns presented by the perpetrators of domestic abuse. We also work with the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, whose objective is to safeguard and promote the welfare of children by ensuring the effectiveness of each organisation who are tasked with child protection, the effectiveness of their service delivery. And finally, the public protection arrangements for Northern Ireland, which I want to spend just a bit more time discussing. The public protection arrangements for Northern Ireland, or PANI, are the equivalent of MAPA in England and Wales, the multi-agency public protection arrangements. PANI is not an organisation, but it is a set of arrangements which require all statutory agencies with responsibilities for child protection and criminal justice to work together to protect the public. Its primary purpose is to reduce an offender's opportunity to offend and to reduce their inclination to offend. We reduce an offender's opportunity to offend through the imposition of external controls such as curfews or civil orders such as violent offence prevention orders. And we aim to reduce an individual's inclination to offend through the interventions and participation in accredited programmes which challenge their attitudes and behaviours to offending behaviour. Agencies share information to assess and manage risk. It's important to say it's about risk management, not risk elimination. And whilst we know many of the interventions provided by PBNI and other partner agencies are effective, we can never completely eliminate risks. Interventions are strengths-based, and we endeavour to identify and focus on a person's strengths, helping the individual to live a pro-social life by building on these strengths. Very briefly, just some background to PANI. I suppose it's worth saying at the outset that PANI originally focused on the management of sex offenders in the community, and it was only in 2010 that individuals convicted of domestic abuse were brought into the arrangements. It goes back to the 1990s, where there was growing concern amongst the public in Northern Ireland about sex offenders living and working in the community. There was a number of high-profile cases, one in particular, that of Martin Houston, who was a convicted sex offender, but who, prior to his conviction, despite there being concerns about his behaviour, worked for a number of statutory and voluntary organisations who were working with vulnerable adults and with children. This case and a number of other cases led to the establishment of the sex offender notification with the PSNI, which in 1997, which requires individuals convicted of certain sexual offences to notify police about their personal details and to update them of any subsequent changes. Then in 2001, MASRAM was established, the Multi-Agency Sex Offender Risk Assessment and Management. But these were voluntary arrangements, and whilst each offender was allocated a designated risk manager and there was an action plan in place to develop, to monitor and manage the risks that they presented, as I say, they were voluntary arrangements. It was following the murder of Mrs. Attractor Haran by Trevor Hamilton in 2003 that led to the end of automatic 50% remission with the introduction of the Criminal Justice Order in 2008 and the introduction of public protection sentences. A strategic management board governs the work of PANI. It's currently chaired by the PSNI's Head of Public Protection Branch and is made up of senior representatives from the Northern Ireland Prison Service, Probation, the Health and Social Care Trusts, the NSPCC and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. It meets on a quarterly basis and provides oversight to the arrangements. However, accountability remains with the individual agencies to deliver their role in the public protection arrangements. There are 5 subgroups to SMB: policy and practice, education, research and training, accommodation, victims, and communication. The local area public protection panels are the multi-agency forums tasked with the operational delivery of public protection in Northern Ireland. LAPs are chaired by area managers within the probation service, and the key responsibilities are for agencies to share information to inform the assessment of risk, to determine a category of risk and devise a risk management plan, and to regularly reassess and review that risk management plan. During the pandemic, LAPs have moved from taking place face-to-face to meeting online. Initially, this was via teleconference and more recently via WebEx. Who can be subject to PANI? As I said at the outset, it was originally set up to manage sex offenders within the community. So the first point there, individuals who are subject to notification requirements with the PSNI under the Sexual Offences Act of 2003. And from 2008, individuals who'd been convicted of a violent offence against a child or a vulnerable adult were brought into the arrangements. And in 2010, individuals convicted of a violent offence in a domestic or family circumstance. And the final category is individuals who have been convicted of a violent offence aggravated by hostility, hate crime. Just want to say a wee bit about review of Article 50 guidance. Article 50 guidance is guidance that was issued or is issued by the Minister of Justice under Article 50 of the Criminal Justice Order 2008. And it states what agencies are required to do to give effect to carrying out their duties in the assessment and management of the risks posed by certain sexual and violent offenders. And the DOJ, the Department of Justice, has recently undertaken a review of the Article 50 guidance. And there were a number of drivers for this. The existing guidance is very dated, was introduced by a previous Minister of Justice, David Ford. It was also recognised that there was a need to future-proof the arrangements in light of the new legislation, that is the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, and also forthcoming legislation in respect of stalking and harassment. So PANI's eligibility criteria in respect of domestic abuse needed to be revised to reflect these new offences and also to provide a focus to coercive and controlling behaviour. And finally, there have been a number of judicial reviews whereby PANI has been the respondent. And these judicial reviews have come about where individuals have challenged their referral into PANI and the assessment processes. Very briefly, just a summary, and I'm not going to go into much detail, but just a summary of the suggested amendments to the Article 50 guidance. One in respect of the governance of PANI. So Strategic Management Board, which is currently chaired on a rotational basis by senior representatives from each of the, or one of the agencies that make up PANI, is now to be chaired by a representative from the DOJ. And that's to ensure that the strategic objectives of PANI are aligned to those of the Minister of Justice and are reflecting his or her priorities. The guidance, so the amendments to the guidance also allows for a wider remit for referral into the arrangements. And that obviously is to include the new domestic abuse offences, also non-contact offences, with a focus on behaviours and not just convictions. And importantly, if an individual is referred into PANI, but it is assessed that they don't meet the serious harm criteria, their name can now be added to a register of persons of concern. And if in the future a further referral is received about the same individual, then the information can be put together, and that may then mean that it does meet the criteria, the threshold of serious harm. Finally, just to mention a couple of areas for future development within PANI. PANI is looking at what measures can be put in place across all agencies to manage those individuals identified as posing a high risk of violence within a domestic setting, but who have not yet been convicted or sentenced. Originally, when PANI came into operation, potentially dangerous persons were included within the eligibility criteria. However, following legal challenges and also the lack of external controls that were available, the category of potentially dangerous persons was removed from the arrangements. So PANI is reviewing if the current processes in respect of PANI and MARIC are effective in managing the risks presented by these individuals, or whether we need to introduce a new multi-agency approach along maybe the lines of what is currently facilitated in Scotland, the multi-agency tasking and coordination process. And finally, we're looking at how we can improve the assessment and management of violent offenders who are not subject to statutory supervision by the Probation Board. We're currently undertaking research in respect of the management of these individuals. We're looking at both quantitative and qualitative data and hoping that this will inform a focus group that has been set up to look at how the actions that we can take to manage offenders who are not compelled in any way to engage with authorities. Thank you very much, and if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Liz, for that really important overview. Getting a wee bit of feedback, Liz, I think. Oh, thanks for that great overview of the public protection arrangements, which is a partnership arrangement for probation, police and others. Are there any questions just before we move on to our next presentation? Not seeing anything coming up in the chat, Liz, so I'm going to move on to our next presentation, and I've asked Jill just to shorten this presentation slightly. We're going a bit over time. Jill Grant, who's Assistant Director in Probation, is going to provide a presentation on some of our domestic abuse programmes and in particular some of the work that we're doing upstream to tackle domestic abuse. So Jill, over to you.
Thanks, Gail. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. As Gail said, I'm Assistant Director for Programmes and Interventions in the Probation Board, and I also have strategic responsibility for domestic abuse in PBNI. There's a lot of what I was going to cover actually that Liz has already touched on. So as Gail has said, I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible so that we can catch up a little bit on time. I'm delighted to be here today to speak to you all about the developments in domestic abuse in Northern Ireland, and specifically in relation to the programmes, and in particular about the Promoting Positive Relationships programme for non-adjudicated men. Just in terms of the context then, we're all aware of the Northern Ireland Domestic and Sexual Violence Strategy, and I'm sure that most of you know about the Programme for Government. Both the strategy and the Programme for Government have victims and reducing the number of victims in Northern Ireland centred to their targets. And as part of that commitment to intervening early in cases of domestic abuse, to reduce further victims and creating a problem-solving approach to do this. We already know from the speakers that have gone before the devastating impact of domestic abuse and the importance of identifying and intervening as early as possible to protect victims and address abusive behaviour. Everything we do in probation is about reducing the number of victims, but we can't talk about victims without talking about perpetrators. For this reason, it's critical to invest in early intervention and treatment to realise opportunities and benefits for justice, health and beyond. So PBNI deliver a range of group work programmes and individual interventions with the purpose of encouraging and facilitating change in the service users that we supervise. The programmes are designed to address a variety of aspects regarding a service user's attitudes and offending behaviour. We look at the factors that contribute to recidivism, and therefore it's essential that we work towards addressing these issues with the aim of encouraging desistance, reducing further offending and ultimately building safer communities. PBNI deliver several domestic abuse programmes and interventions, and it's really important to say that they aren't a soft option. It is challenging for the men that we work with to address their abusive behaviour and learn new ways of engaging in intimate partner relationships, albeit it's necessary. All of our domestic abuse programmes, as Liz has said, are strength-based and focus on the impact of domestic abuse on victims and wider society. We've been a bit on a bit of a developmental journey in relation to our domestic abuse suite of programmes, from Men Overcoming Domestic Violence to the Integrated Domestic Abuse Programme to what we currently have, which is the Building Better Relationships Programme, and now our early intervention programmes, Promoting Positive Relationships, PPRP, and the Respectful Relationships programme. It's worth considering why we should invest in treatment. First and foremost, to ensure that there are fewer victims and create safer communities. It gives more options for sentencers and indeed for health and social services, and enables us to focus on treating the root causes of offending. Importantly, it can reduce prison populations by addressing the problem behaviour in the community, and in the case of PPRP, diverting people away from the criminal justice system. And finally, it's cost effective. This slide shows the domestic abuse pathway in PBNI for adjudicated males. So if the individual presents a medium or high risk or needs using the Be Safer assessment, along with a number of other criteria, then they can potentially be suitable for BBR. This is an accredited group work programme designed to reduce reoffending by adult males convicted of violence against an intimate partner. The programme has a strong theoretical base, taking into account recent developments in thinking and research in relation to aggression within relationships. The PBNI Respectful Relationships intervention aims to develop educational awareness about what constitutes healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships. It includes the personal identification of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and the physiology and impact of abusive behaviour on victims, including children. And this is a low-need intervention. These programmes are not designed for females. However, we're currently piloting a programme for females called Beyond Violence in partnership with the Northern Ireland Prison Service. So in relation to PPRP then, in July 2014, PBNI were awarded funding by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health to develop an intervention programme to address domestic abuse for alleged perpetrators, and in 2018 the pilot programme began in the Western Trust. As I've mentioned, it's a strengths-based programme for unadjudicated men who have demonstrated the potential to be abusive in intimate partner relationships and whose children have been assessed as at risk by social services within the Health and Social Care Trusts. It's delivered over 24 sessions, with each session 2 hours in duration. And as Liz mentioned earlier, we have the really crucial component of the partner support worker, which is delivered with PPRP by Women's Aid. The role of the partner support worker is to support the current or ex-partner of the participant, assist them importantly with safety planning, provide information about the content of the programme, provide information regarding a participant's progress in the programme, and signpost the partner to other agencies. PPRP is presently being delivered in all 5 trust areas in Northern Ireland. PBNI Psychology Department provide clinical oversight for all programmes and interventions, and there's a dedicated psychologist for each accredited programme. I know that a number of the team are here today from PPRP, and I want to pay tribute to them and their manager, Anne Weir, who has worked tirelessly over the last few years to get the programme to the stage where it received accreditation status from the Respect accreditation body in December 2021. It's incredible really to see the amount that's been achieved over the last 24 months in spite of the pandemic. And as Liz has said, these programmes have continued to be delivered remotely throughout the pandemic by using telephone calls and other virtual platforms. The PPRP programme incorporates an educational element, CBT, skills practice techniques, and the development of emotional intelligence to address unhealthy and abusive behaviours in intimate relationships. All PBNI domestic abuse programmes are supported by evidence-based research. There are a number of programme aims with PPRP, the primary goal being to promote healthy relationships and reduce the risk of abuse against intimate partners and children. Similar to respectful relationships, PPRP aims to explore healthy, unhealthy and abusive relationships, including the personal identification of thoughts, feelings, beliefs and physiology in relation to a person's own behaviours. The programme aims to educate participants on the impact of healthy and abusive behaviours on victims, including children. And one of the other aims is to develop communication skills, emotional management techniques, supportive resources and responsible parenting. The referral criteria is relatively simple. It's any male who is over 18 who can speak English. They must acknowledge a certain level of abusive behaviour within an intimate relationship and be willing to sign the conditions of success and the statement of understanding form. Crucially, safety planning work must be completed with the partner or former partner and the children prior to the commencement on the programme, and they need to have a certain level of motivation and be willing to attend the programme. So in terms of the actual programme process then, the programme referral is made by social services who complete the initial assessment. The PPR team determine the programme need using the Be Safer assessment tool. As I mentioned earlier, in order to be assessed as suitable for PPRP, the risk must be moderate or high, or if low, then we can then deliver the respectful relationships intervention, but this is only for adjudicated males. As I also mentioned, if the person's assessed as suitable, we'll make a referral to the partner support worker, which is provided by Women's Aid. And then the programme commences, and it's an integrated approach with PBNI, social services and Women's Aid, with regular liaison with police and other statutory and community voluntary sector organisations as required. Weekly information is shared with social workers. We have regular practitioner meetings scheduled with social services and Women's Aid and the required training provided. There are also regional steering groups in each of the trusts which meet regularly. And in terms of governance, there's a quarterly governance meeting with representation from each trust area, the DOJ, PBNI, the Women's Aid Federation. Once the programme's completed and PBNI then completes the end of programme report, this is provided to social services to inform their assessments. And then we feed into the evaluations. So there are 5 modules that need to be completed as part of the programme: the foundation module, the behaviour and communication module, the managing emotions module, the responsible parenting module, which is really critical in terms of the strength-based approach, and finally the future planning module. These are some of the skills that are covered in the programme. Throughout the duration of the programme, the men are expected to use these skills from week to week in their interactions with their partners and their families and provide examples to the group each week. The programme has been evaluated a number of times now, but the most recent evaluation was completed by the Analytical Services Group in the DOJ, and the evaluation covered the 2019-2020 programme. And a number of benefits were identified. Participants said that the programme had a positive impact on their behaviour and that it was likely or very likely that they will now take more responsibility for their harmful behaviour. The majority reported that it enabled them to manage their feelings and emotions, and approximately 1/5 stated that it made them more self-aware. Others said it had enabled them to recognise triggers, understand the impact of their actions on others, and have a more positive outlook. Importantly, social workers reported notable changes in behaviours from those who had engaged in the programme, stating that some were more open to considering the impact of their behaviours and evidenced more willingness to apply learning and make progress. 3/4 of the partners said that overall the programme had been helpful or very helpful in addressing their partner's abusive behaviour. Initial long-term data supplied by the PSNI 1-year post-programme for the 2018-19 cohort showed that 1 incident had resulted in prosecution. While 7 of the other 24 participants had been involved in domestic abuse incidents, these had not resulted in any prosecution. So this slide shows some of the outcomes identified by over 70% of partners or ex-partners. They had said that they noticed the following skills being learnt after the perpetrator had attended the programme. So they had demonstrated more of an openness and willingness to discuss feelings, willingness to listen to their partner. They had learned skills around the use of timeout and anger management. They were demonstrating the wish to spend quality time with their family, being more patient with their children. They'd also demonstrated that they had taken responsibility for their actions and were understanding of the consequences of their choices. Over 70% referred to improved coping mechanisms and improving decision making. So this afternoon, I have covered the suite of domestic abuse programmes that PBNI deliver, both in relation to the adjudicated and non-adjudicated males, but I've specifically focused on the early interventions and PPRP. There's an evaluation of last year's programme underway, and we hope to receive this in the coming weeks to inform this year's delivery. I mean, finally, just to say this prevention work is central to providing better outcomes for women and children. Domestic abuse has no place in our society, and in partnership, we can tackle and eradicate all forms of domestic abuse. Thank you.
Jill, thank you very much for that. Jill, there's just one question in the chat. Can you please clarify that RRP is only for adjudicated males?
The Respectful Relationships Programme is only for adjudicated males.
Yeah, thanks, Jill.
Yeah.
That's the only question I can see in the chat. So going to move now to our final presentation today, which is from the Domestic Homicide Review Chair Anne Marks. Anne is going to just reflect on the first 18 months since the introduction of domestic homicide reviews and have a think about what we've learned that will help us in the future. So Anne, going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody see the screen and see me as well? I hope you can hear me.
We can all hear you, Anne, and we can see the presentation. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So what I'm going to do in the very short time I have, and thank you, Gail, for inviting me along here today to speak to the lunchtime seminar. I know we're a wee bit ahead of time or behind time, so I'm going to be as quick as I can with this. So I'm going to give really my reflections of the domestic homicide review process since its introduction here. Almost about 18 months ago now, from my perspective as a domestic homicide review chair. What I don't propose to do is actually get into specific cases. There have been 8 domestic homicide reviews commissioned so far. I have and I am involved in 4 of those cases, some of which have now been completed. But it's just unfortunate those that have been completed are going through that quality assurance process at the moment. So I'm not going to talk specifically about those cases. I think that'd be inappropriate to do so. But what I will say, I will give you some indication of, I suppose, what I see as some of those emerging overarching themes over the last 18 months that I'm noticing. Okay. I'm just trying to move this on. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of problem moving us on here. So you're okay, Anne. We'll help there. Can you might be...
And if you stop sharing, I can share the full thing for you. Brilliant. Is that okay now? Yeah.
Yeah, we've got rid of yours. It'll just take a wee second to. There we go. That's us.
Okay. Brilliant, brilliant. So if we go on to the second slide. Okay, so I suppose just to say then, for those who aren't familiar with domestic homicide reviews, or just as a bit of a refresher, they're about really identifying opportunities to improve organisational and community responses to domestic abuse, and in a manner that is victim focused. And how we go about this, myself and the team, is really about looking and reviewing systems and processes of organisations who have been providing services to victim, to the perpetrator, to other family members, looking at how efficient those are, looking as well as probably the strategic and local environment within that organisation. For example, looking at what training, skills, supports that's provided to staff and professionals. What were their knowledge? What was the competence in this area? For example, the identification and understanding of domestic abuse. And was there a good understanding of risk factors and how can that be improved upon? And I suppose as well that we do look, and there's no doubt about it, we do look as well for new practice good practice that we can also share within and across organisations. And there is that piece finally about looking at the public understanding and knowledge of domestic abuse in all its different shapes and forms. How does one seek help? What barriers are there, and how we might identify how those barriers might be broken down. So if you just want to move on. Yeah. Okay. So I suppose the points of note so far, I suppose I want to break this down into two areas. First of all, the process, and then secondly, those emerging themes that I see that I mentioned at the outset there. I think the overarching point I want to make is the importance of undertaking domestic homicide reviews cannot be underestimated. These reviews of the most tragic of circumstances have provided a rich source of information about the nature of domestic abuse, again, in all its forms, how organisations work together and what can be learned from this moving forward. And I suppose what panics me a tiny bit is about, I suppose, maybe missed opportunities, what happened before the domestic homicide review process was actually introduced here in Northern Ireland. So looking at the process, I can't stress enough the absolute benefit of having engagement with family and friends and sometimes others as well. And I say engagement, meaningful engagement with family and friends and others. I, as a chair, and the panel will get the narrative from organisations, their narrative, but it's refreshing to get the family narrative as well. And sometimes, in fact, most times that will reinforce what the information is that we're already getting in from organisations. But sometimes that can actually give a different perspective. And it's refreshing as well when you listen to families and what their thoughts and views are on how practice might be improved, and that gives us something really to work at. And I suppose there hasn't been probably 3 out of the 4 cases, whereby I do get significant new information that organisations are unaware of, and again that adds to the learning. And I suppose importance as well is to say that where there are criminal justice proceedings ongoing, of course, the importance of engaging with police at that stage, but it is really worthwhile putting the efforts into that engagement with family and friends. And it is also a two-way process. I think it's really important to actually know more about the loved one who's no longer here, their personality, what mattered to them, their interests. And I say that because I know from my perspective, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the panel members as well, you do go that extra mile to do your best for family, for the person that's no longer here, and for improving practice for others in the future. Secondly, I also really can't stress enough the benefits of having a panel member on my team who is from a support service. So whether that be Women's Aid, the Men's Advisory Project, or Victim Support, in my cases so far it has been Women's Aid. And that panel member really on 2 fronts is so important. One, they bring with them that rich narrative of the lived experiences of victims. And 2, in most of the cases I've dealt with so far, there's such a wealth of information coming in that it is so easy for myself and for panel members to get distracted and go down different avenues and different routes. And I have found that the representative from the support service organisation is very good at bringing us back on course again, reminding us, we need to be more victim focused here, and that I find is of great importance as well. The last part to do with the process, I think it's really important. I suppose all organisations who are involved in this process need to keep an eye on is what their engagement is in the process itself, that you have good structures in place to deal with a domestic homicide review once you're informed that one has been commissioned. So in terms of securing information and so forth, and importantly, that you have structures in place that you quite quickly identify who the person is, who is, I suppose, collecting and coordinating the information and trying to make sense of it before it's submitted into to me and to the panel for review. I can't stress that enough. I think organisations who have already been involved in a domestic homicide review have quite quickly learned the importance of doing that. And I understand coming out of the pandemic, resourcing issues, high workloads, you know, the last thing you need is a new process that you have to manage. But having a structure in place will aid that. It means that the domestic homicide review itself won't be delayed for any length of time, and it means that the learning gets out there a lot quicker. So it's good if you haven't got a structure in place for some of those organisations in Northern Ireland, you haven't been involved in one, please give that some thought. As to the emerging themes, just very quickly, there is a real need to have a more, or improve that collaborative and coordinated response to addressing, sometimes from my experience in the cases I've dealt with, the entire needs of those involved, victim, the perpetrator, the wider family as well, and children and so forth, both internally and across organisations, you know, and that does lead to early identification of vulnerability and absolutely earlier intervention, because some of the victim families that we're dealing with are known to multiple services, and this can sometimes be a wee bit just disjointed. So for example, you will have maybe criminal justice agencies, police, probation, prisons, courts, public prosecution services regularly involved perhaps with the offender. You will have like health professionals from GP to specialist health professionals involved with individuals within the family, housing involvement and so forth. And it really, there needs to be, what I see, a wee bit better communication between all of those in terms of getting that bigger picture and providing like a more holistic response to their needs. Grasping the bigger picture, it's really important that we need to grasp the history of what has happened before, look for those patterns of harmful behaviour, view the victim, the perpetrator, other relevant family members through that wide-eyed lens, as opposed to just looking what's in front of you. And that seems to be a theme coming through. You know, so when you're engaging with the victim, you're actually asking yourself what else is going on in that person's life now and what else has gone on before. And it's similar with the perpetrator as well, looking at those interpersonal relationships. I've put down here assumptions, you know, what I mean by that, you know, there's great training, great policy, procedures, and guidance that are there to support professionals. But all I ask is that you have effective procedures in place to actually determine, are those working in practice? Are they effective in practice? So, you know, when a professional's trained in, for example, in a particular area, when they leave the classroom, do they understand their training? Are they actually applying it in practice? How do you know that? What's your auditing and governance like around that, your evidence of that? High harm individuals, high harm abusers. I think there's a notable gap here, and I'm talking specifically about those high harm abusers who actually don't reach the threshold for PBNI or equivalent MAPA management of risk. So often known to multiple services, and how that's proactively managed here in Northern Ireland. I think there's a real urgent need to develop a coordinated, effective approach with clear pathways across the likes of criminal justice agencies, health, housing and voluntary sector as well. Misinformed held views of domestic abuse. I do think out there in the community, there's still that sense that some cases are caused by addictions, alcohol misuse, mental health illness, you know, which is quite worrying because that's reinforced, you know, within communities. I can see within families and even with children, which no doubt will have an impact in later life. And you know, it is quite worrying as well as a side issue. You know, I find myself speaking to family and friends and actually, you know, having to be the one to actually chip away at that. To correct that view that, for example, you know, there are many people with significant mental health issues. There are many people who have addictions, but the vast majority do not go on to murder. So that's something that seems to be a thing that's coming through as well. And finally, I just want to say about children, you know, I come from a career where I worked in terms, most of my career in safeguarding children. And I always thought I knew what the impact was of domestic abuse on children. And it wasn't until I actually got involved in this and pulling information together in the domestic homicide review process that actually, I don't know that I did know at all the seriousness for children living in domestic abuse circumstances cannot be underestimated. And in my cases, it's compounded as well by losing a loved one, and how that no doubt will significantly impact on their future life. Again, can't be underestimated. That's a very quick whiz through. I hope that it made some kind of sense to you, and certainly if you have any questions, I'm happy to take that.
And thank you so much. And that comment you made about looking at things through a wide-eyed lens rather than just looking at what's before you is so critical and important. So we have been running over time, but we do have some time for questions to any of the speakers. So if I could just ask if you want to put up your hand or put any questions in the chat, let me know. And I'm conscious you have been asking questions as we've gone along. So just let me know. I'm not seeing anything in the chat at the moment, but I know it takes a while, and it's hard to scroll through all the faces here. So yeah, Janice.
Hi. Well, firstly, thank you very much indeed. This has been a really intense but very interesting session, and I'd like to really thank all the speakers. I've been typing furiously and taking notes, and it's been really interesting to hear. My question is directed at Anne. So sorry, Anne, you're always the last one. How do you think GDPR helps or hinders these processes where there needs to be, you want to see that involvement with other agencies, that other agencies can easily share information, and how is that considered in relation to domestic homicide reviews?
Okay, thank you for that question. GDPR, so far, I haven't come across a case yet whereby there has been a reluctance to share information and with the process itself. And I suppose, I'm very conscious of maintaining the confidence, particularly where there's a criminal injustice investigation, because the last thing we want to do is really step on anybody's toes and interfere with that. So there has to be great collaboration between myself and police in terms of how that progresses, how we work in tandem together. And certainly there can be nothing concluded where there is a criminal investigation until after the conclusion of the criminal proceedings. That said, in terms of the domestic homicide review process, and I think you're alluding as well to maybe the sharing of the information coming from domestic homicide reviews. So now, this isn't down to me, so I'm just offering my own views on that, because that hasn't been determined yet, and it's not something for me as Domestic Homicide Review Chair to determine, and that will be by the Senior Oversight Forum. So there has to be a balance struck, a clear balance struck between getting learning out to professionals and individuals, but also getting learning out there to the public as well, and that has to be balanced against protecting the family. And I also am very conscious of children involved. So I think those are the thoughts I would assume the Senior Oversight Forum will be applying to that. And I also think of interest, you know, part of that thinking as well would need to be, I don't know if you heard the BBC News just a few weeks ago there about Beechcroft and the death of a young person there. And I suppose that balance and the commentary around that would need to be taken into consideration as well, about what is the right balance about protecting family, but also ensuring that the public are made aware of critical elements as well. But I've no doubt there will be information shared with the public. It's just, I'm not sure that that thinking has to be applied yet as just to how much, if that makes sense.
It does, no, and thank you for that. And I suppose the other aspect I'm thinking of is actually the sharing. You know, you'd mentioned that, you know, there's you know, maybe poor connections at times between all the different agencies who are working prior to something like that happening. You know,
Yeah.
prior to, you know, you know, an incident, a critical incident happening or a fatal incident happening, and that different people have all these different pieces of information, so it's like a different jigsaw. And that if there was if you could look through the wider lens, I think you talked about looking at it in the wider lens, if that was available, you know, and everyone was able to share that information easily, I suppose that's the bit as well. I'm also thinking about, you know, that sometimes with GDPR that is prevented, you're prevented from sharing that, you know, information maybe more than you would like to be prevented, if that makes sense.
Well, yes, it does. And I suppose on that point, you know, I do see where there is a nervousness by professionals in sharing information, and I'm not quite sure they've always got it right. You know, their understanding of that, maybe, yeah, you know, that has come into play. You know, where there is that nervousness, and probably, not probably, there will need to be some work done around that.
Thanks for that. Just another couple of questions in. We have one from Joanne McPadden. Just before I move on to that, there's one in the chat from Jackie Durkin. Jackie's thanking all the speakers and just saying, in regard to Lindsay's comments on increases in high harm and serious offences, given the pre-existing delays in court proceedings, particularly Crown Court trial recovery from the pandemic, what are the panel's views on the risk of victims and witnesses withdrawing statements and prosecutions not leading to conviction because of delays in case progression and disposal? So that's one for the entire panel. If we'll maybe take that first and then go to Joanne.
Yeah, I'll just come in quickly around that one, because I had said I was actually going to talk about domestic abuse courts and then realised I was running over time. So we are working with a number of key criminal justice partners to look to see when we can pilot a bespoke and specific domestic abuse court. So that is something that's very much the forefront of our minds, because we do see victim attrition higher in domestic and sexual crime than in any other crime type. You know, and it's the one of many crimes, or one of few crimes, sorry, that we know the perpetrator, we know who the victim is, and we know that we really secure the bulk of the evidence between those two parties. So I do hope that with the introduction of the domestic abuse pilot court, and we will start to see those reductions to more timeliness in terms of securing outcomes from an end-to-end process. And that's obviously no slight to PPS and court. It simply is a demand and process.
Perfect. Anybody else in the panel? Liz, do you have a comment in relation to that? Or Kelly?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, it is a concern, obviously, the delay, but just to note that the new advocacy service as well is also there to support victims and to try and keep them engaged on their journey towards court, to hopefully prevent victims from dropping out of that process. But obviously anything that can be done to reduce the length of time would be very welcome, and to see it just go through the length of time. 2 years, for example, is just far too long, and for the anxiety that causes victims, it's, you know, it's really not good enough. And I think we should all do what we can to reduce that time frame if there's any way possible.
Thanks, Kelly. Liz, did you want to say?
Just to add that obviously the Gillen review has looked at this as well, and just how the importance of keeping victims on board and hearing the voice of the victim as well. So that's important to take into consideration too.
Thanks all. Hope that answers it for you, Jackie. Joanne, do you have a question? Joanne McPadden?
Yep, sorry, it took me a while to work out where my mic was.
You're grand.
Sorry. I should fess up and say that I was involved in the initial work to do with domestic homicide reviews. So I have a question to Anne, but also to the panel on them. And the main question is, from recollection of looking at domestic homicide reviews from England and Wales, I remember a lot of the learning being the same from one review to another around better partnership working, better communication. So I just wonder strategically and operationally, whether that be across the board or at an organisational level, what do you think needs to be in place so that learning is actually learned, and that you know, we do sort of build on domestic homicide reviews and sort of avoid any mistakes being repeated, even to the same extent in the future as they potentially have been?
Thanks, Joanne, for that. I suppose there's an onus on the chair, so myself and the other two chairs, and I've been quite vocal on this this area. First of all, I get on my soapbox about recommendations that are made by organisations. As anybody who knows that works on my panel or has done individual learning reviews will know, that the recommendations that are made have to be meaningful in the first instance. They really and have to be achievable. There's no point, you know, making recommendations that aren't achievable, that either, you know, in the scale of things can't be done, you know, or right out there that nothing has been tested, that there haven't been the conversation with our organisations to say yes, this can happen. So they have to be achievable in the first instance. And then secondly, what I have in terms of engagement with the other chairs, I think there is something about, as opposed to the same recommendations being made in every report that comes out, you know, communication, as opposed to that in every report. If the recommendation has been already made, then they should be referring to that in the new domestic homicide review of a previous recommendation, as opposed to having thousands of recommendations that nobody can keep a track of at the end of the day, if that makes sense, Joanne.
And thank you.
Sorry. Yes, thanks.
Joanne, is that okay for you? Thanks, and thanks, Anne. Not seeing any more questions. Anybody else with their hand up? Don't think I'm seeing anything at the minute. So that brings us to an end. We've had some just comments thanking the panel for a really informative and useful session. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank the panel of speakers who have been brilliant today, and we've come together in the spirit of partnership to do this, and I think it's worked well. Thank you all for being here today and taking the time out. As I said, this is the beauty of online. So thank you all. We'll send out the presentations. We have your email addresses and you'll get them all sent out by email. Thank you all.